Revelation 2757. From the 28th of May 1943. Will of God and permission of God. Men's will fights against divine will in vain. He is indeed free, that is he can want but not always carry out what he wants. And consequently he will never be able to accomplish anything by virtue of his will if God's will is directed against it. For everything has to comply with his will. His will rules heaven and earth, and his will can never be trumped by human will. Yet for the most part God does not oppose human will with his will, nor does he prevent the human being from carrying out his own will. Then he can bring his will to bear, but then he will also have to answer for it. What God himself wants is extremely wise and therefore always good. What the human being wants can certainly be permitted by God, but therefore need not always be good. And therefore a distinction must be made between God's will and God's permission, for what God allows is always based on human will and very often lacks wisdom and also love. So in a manner of speaking God gives his approval to a defective intention, to an intention whose leitmotif is neither to be found in love nor in wisdom and which therefore must contradict divine will. God tolerates it, but he never approves of it. But if he were to oppose it with his own will, then the human being's free will could never come into effect, thus it could not be acknowledged either. On the other hand, however, the human being could never be called to account because then he would never be able to carry out something which is bad and he would have to carry out the good under a certain compulsion, since he would be prevented by God from doing the opposite. And therefore the greatest chaos can exist on earth. Divine will not take action against it as long as human will itself creates this chaos. For God's purpose in tolerating it is that the human being himself comes to realize and changes his will, that he subordinates himself to divine will and returns to divine order of his own accord, that is that he stands in godlike will and acts accordingly. Only when the human being's will becomes increasingly wrong, when he distances himself further and further from the divine order, then God sets his will against it. Then the human being's will is powerless and cannot oppose God's will. Then he cannot carry out what he wants and yet he has to answer for the wrong will because it is free. The strength to carry it out always comes to him from the side which his will turns towards. God supports him if his will is good, but God's adversary gives him his power and strength if the human being's will declares itself willing to work for him by being willing to accomplish things which run counter to divine will and divine order. However, God then allows his will to become action if the human will completely fails, and this means a danger for the whole of humanity. Then God's will visibly comes into action, and the human will is unable to oppose the divine will, for it alone reigns in heaven and on earth. Amen.